So I'm going to now take this opportunity to introduce our four speakers to you, and I'll do so in the order in which they will be sharing their thoughts today. And first is my colleague, Crystal N. Feimster. A native of North Carolina, Professor Feimster is an associate professor in the departments of African American Studies and History and the programs of American Studies and Women and Gender and Sexuality Studies at Yale University, where she teaches a range of courses in 19th and 20th century African American history, women's history, and Southern history. I can say also she's teaching the largest course in Yale's history department this semester. Professor Feimster is the author of Southern Horrors, Women in the Politics of Rape and Lynching, a history of how Black and white women in the US South were affected by and responded to the problems of rape and lynching in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Thank you, Professor Feimster, for being here. Juliet Hooker is professor of political science at Brown University. She is a political theorist specializing in racial justice, Latin American political thought, and Black political thought. Professor Hooker is the author of Race and the Politics of Solidarity and Theorizing Race in the Americas, Douglas, Sarmiento, Du Bois, and Vasconcelos, which was a recipient of the American Political Science Association's 2018 Ralph Bunche Award and the 2018 Best Book Award of the Race, Ethnicity, and Politics section of the American Political Science Association. Renee Ater is Provost Visiting Associate Professor in Africana Studies at Brown University and Associate Professor Emerita at the University of Maryland. A public scholar who works at the intersection of art and history, Ater's research focuses on monuments, race, national identity, and public space. She is the author of Keith Morrison, Volume 5 of the David C. Driscoll series of African American art, and Remaking Race and History, The Sculpture of Meta Warwick Fuller. Finally, our fourth speaker is Daniel Magaziner, professor of history at Yale University. The author of books on religion, art, and politics in 20th century South Africa, Professor Magaziner is currently writing two books at the intersection of biography, art history, and 20th century African intellectual history. He is also the editor of the Oxford Handbook on South Africa. I'm going to now turn this over to Professor Feimster, inviting each of our four speakers again to share their thoughts for up to 10 minutes. And then once they've concluded, we'll have time for questions and answers. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Steve, for that introduction. But moreover, I want to thank both Professor Pitti and Professor Rose for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. Also want to send a shout out to Soraya McPherson and Trey Austin Swan for all their work behind the scenes. And I know there are probably many others who have been lifting us up in this process. So thank you. I also want to just take a second to acknowledge, as Steve did, that many of us are really heartbroken about the news regarding no convictions around the Breonna Taylor murder, and that I'm hoping that this is a space where we can kind of do some work and a little bit of healing and thinking about what justice for Breonna looks like in the days ahead. So this summer, after Minneapolis police officers murdered George Floyd on May 25th, 2020, and video footage went viral, and news of Breonna Taylor's murder earlier in the spring in Kentucky by police officers gained currency, people took to the streets in protest, and a wave of statue failing swept across the United States and England. Inspired by Black Lives Matter movement, monuments were toppled, statues were rolled over into the rivers, and Black ballerinas danced around the graffiti base of a Confederate general. By the end of July, more than 120 statues and fountains honoring the Confederacy had been dismantled. At least 14 monuments dedicated to people accused of genocide against Native Americans had fallen. 33 statues of Columbus were defaced or removed. So were 9 statues of figures such as Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and Teddy Roosevelt. In many other countries, statues and street names of slave traders and colonial governors met a similar fate. Pushed by organized groundswell of opposition to long-standing symbols of the Confederacy and white supremacy, a major reconsideration of how the history of colonization, slavery, and white supremacy and how it's all taught and viewed through public art and memorials is furiously underway now. Calls for change started long before the protest of this summer. Indeed, we are not here by accident. This is a product of enormous work, a long history, but we only need to look back over the last 10 years, beginning with the protests following the murder of Trayvon Martin in 2012 and the founding of the movement for Black Lives Matter in 2013 by Opal Tometi and Alicia Garza and Patrisse Cullors to identify a turning point in public protests. Indeed, no one has forgotten the summer of 2015 after a white supremacist shot and killed 9 Black parishioners at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and how activist Bree Newsom climbed a 30-foot flagpole and removed the Confederate flag that waved over the grounds of the South Carolina State Capitol, reigniting a national debate about the place of Confederate monuments in Southern cities. The State General Assembly voted to officially remove the Confederate flag, but within 2 weeks they did after that event. And across the country, students and university administrators, activists, and local officials grappled with how to deal with Confederate monuments on their campuses, in city parks, on the names of countless public and private buildings. As many of you know, Yale went through this in 2016 when the administration refused to respond to student protests to rename Calhoun College, but then revisited the issue again in 2017 when they did eventually rename the college. Many of you probably caught wind of the UNC Chapel Hill protest in which the statue of Silent Sam was pulled down. In New Orleans, we know that in 2015, activists organized Take Them Down and called on the reluctant Mayor Landrieu to remove the city's Confederate monuments. And on May 19th, 2017, after 2 years of legal wrangling, violent protests, and last-minute passage of legislation aimed at blocking the removal of Civil War monuments in New Orleans, workers dressed in face-concealing gear and bulletproof vests removed the 16-foot tall, 8,000-pound statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee from its 60-foot high pedestal. The monument, situated in Lee Circle, a traffic roundabout between the city's bustling central business district and the wealthy Garden District neighborhood of antebellum mansions, was the last of 4 monuments removed from the city's historic landscape. Now, the removal of the first 3 monuments, an obelisk commemorating the Battle of Liberty Place and 1874 white supremacist uprising, which was a 6-foot statue, also a 6-foot statue of Confederate President Jefferson Davis, and a 6-ton equestrian statue of General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, who shot the opening fires at the Civil War at Fort Sumter. Those removals were shrouded in secrecy and dismantled in the cover of darkness because of threats of violence. Now, Robert E. Lee's final retreat, however, was announced in advance and took place in broad daylight as Mayor Mitch Landrieu spoke to an invitation-only crowd in the historic Geller Hall. Now, removing the 4 monuments, he told his audience, was about truth and history, and I quote, about showing the whole world that we as a city and as a people are able to acknowledge, understand, reconcile, and most importantly, choose a better future for ourselves, making straight what has been crooked and making right what was wrong. Otherwise, we will continue to pay a price with discord, with division, and yes, with violence. This was New Orleans' opportunity, he argued, to get it right and to help the rest of the country do the same. Now, what I found most significant about Landry's speech was when he recalled how a friend had asked him to consider the issue from the perspective of an African-American mother or father trying to explain to their fifth grade daughter who Robert E. Lee is and why a statue of him towers over the city. Can you do it? His friend asked. Can you look into that young girl's eyes and convince her that Robert E. Lee is there to encourage her? Do you think she will feel inspired and hopeful by the story? Do these monuments help her see a future with limitless potential? Have you ever thought that if her potential is limited, yours is too? Now, in trying to answer these simple questions, Landry imagined what he called a searing truth in the eyes of a little Black girl, a truth that he could not walk away from. And the lesson that Landry drew was not only the democratic possibility of a world envisioned through the eyes of a young Black girl, but also the need for a more inclusive history. Indeed, by imagining the world through the eyes of a young Black girl, we are reminded that it matters not only whose stories we choose to tell, but how we tell those stories in the monuments that we decide to build or to tear down. To be sure, the removal of Confederate monuments will not change the past, for in the words of William Shakespeare, Lady Macbeth, what's done cannot be undone. But history matters, and the statue failings of the last 5 years, whether via official means or protests, captures what historians have long understood, that the stories we tell about the past have immense power. The past must be interpreted and narrated by powerful storytellers, because the stories we tell become the primary source of human action, shaping public events, laws, policies, court decisions, and the kind of world we envision for ourselves and generations to come. Those of us who aspire to affect public opinion and policy, and thus to shape our collective destiny, must always ask ourselves not only which stories to advance, contest, and accept as true, but also how to discipline those stories with research and experience and advance them with power. And yes, the fall and rise of monuments is part of that work. Now, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice and the Legacy Museum, which opened in April 2018 in Montgomery, Alabama, is a perfect example of the power of monuments and memorials to reshape the cultural landscape and to dictate our movements for social justice and racial equality. Described as, and I quote, the nation's first memorial dedicated to the legacy of enslaved Black people, people terrorized by lynching, African Americans humiliated by racial segregation and Jim Crow, and people of color burdened with contemporary presumptions of guilt and police violence. The monument and the museum reflect years of historical scholarship and social justice activism, but moreover, the Equal Justice Initiative led by Brian Stevenson remind us that monuments and museums do not stand alone, but are part of a dynamic campaign for not only a more truthful remembrance and an accurate reflection of our history, but also a movement for justice in real time. Indeed, one of the many projects that have evolved around the monuments and museums of the Equal Justice Project is called the Community Remembrance Project, which works with the communities to erect historical markers, organize soil collection ceremonies, and to hold essay contests for local high school students to support the development of local community-led efforts to engage with and discuss past and present issues of racial justice. And after a community is engaged in this remembrance work, the Equal Justice Initiative then gives them one of the monuments that they've created that represents a lynching in that county to place in their community. And I think this is an excellent example of how local communities can claim public space for monuments that represent their history and also their ongoing commitments to social justice. And I'm going to end there. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I am going to share my screen. And thank you to Professor Feimster for that wonderful introduction, which raised a lot of the issues that I'm going to continue to talk about in my remarks. And in particular, I am interested in this question of how monuments are taken down and what this means for democracy in particular. So I want to begin with the image of, that I think we're all familiar with, of the way in which the Lee statue in Richmond, which is very significant and which I'm going to spend some time talking about today, has been reimagined in various ways through graffiti, through the projections that we see here in this image, and other forms of reclaiming of that space. Now, the statue of Robert E. Lee, the enormous equestrian statue, was built during the most sustained era of Confederate commemoration, when most Confederate monuments were installed, the late 1880s to 1890s, when Reconstruction was overthrown and lynching was at its apex in the United States. And this was a period followed from 1900 to the 1920s, when states were codifying Jim Crow laws, and racial segregation and the Ku Klux Klan were resurgent. So Confederate monuments were built with particular intents, political intents in mind, and monument unveilings during this era were rituals that were meant to celebrate and cement the rebirth of white supremacy, such as the unveiling of the Lee Monument, which took place in May of 1890. These were rituals that were attended by, as in the case of the Lee Monument, by hundreds of thousands of white Southerners. And as one participant in the festivities surrounding the unveiling of the Lee Monument observed, he felt, quote, "I felt as though I were assisting at a combined funeral and resurrection." In contrast to the white Southerners who celebrated the rebirth of white supremacy through the unveiling of Confederate monuments, African Americans vigorously contested and opposed the construction of these monuments, including the one of Lee in Richmond, even as their political power was shrinking and they were unable to stop them from being built. For example, in an editorial in the Richmond Planet, which was a newspaper founded in 1882 by former enslaved people, and which is one of the South's most forceful Black voices during this era, its publisher, John Mitchell, prophesied that because Blacks had performed much of the physical labor to erect the Lee Monument, he said, quote, "The Negro was in the northern processions for Decoration Day, and in the southern ones, Decoration Day is the holiday that preceded Memorial Day, if only to carry buckets of ice water. He put up the Lee Monument, and should the time come, will be there to take it down." And it took more than a century, but in 2020, Mitchell's prophetic claim is finally coming true. Now, as a political theorist, I have been interested in the way in which political theorists have, to the extent that they've approached the topic, thought about the question of Confederate monument removal. And I have been interested in the fact that rather than focusing on the political function of Confederate monuments, political theorists and philosophers have generally focused their inquiries on the kinds of considerations that should guide the process of making decisions about removal. Or on what the potential civic effects of debates about removal might be. So there's a kind of procedural approach that effectively mandates that the interests of proponents and opponents of removal should receive equal treatment. And then the question then becomes how to fairly accommodate competing interests grounded in basic liberal principles, i.e. protecting free speech versus minimizing racial harm. And so dominant liberal frameworks provide unsatisfactory answers to questions about whether to remove Confederate monuments because they focus on the impact of debates about removal in and of themselves, irrespective of whether we should remove or what what happens, what work these monuments do. And so the focus becomes on how civic dialogue about whether or not to remove or to contextualize can deepen democracy, instead of squarely facing the question of what political lessons racist monuments impart. And also about how we should think about how is it that we might move past democratic or legislative impasse. And this is important because following the law is actually a problem because it reinforces the authority of agreements that were made when Black people weren't even allowed to vote. And we're saying they should still be enforceable. And this is the way in which many monuments were prevented from being removed, and in which attempts at removal have dragged on for years. And I want to spend a little time here talking about the example of Charlottesville. So after the Charleston massacre in 2015, Charlottesville began a process of rethinking its Confederate monuments. And they received a petition to remove a statue of Robert E. Lee, and the city council created a Blue Ribbon Commission on Race, Memorials, and Public Spaces to consider whether to remove the statues of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. Now, these statues had both been donated to the city and installed at a time when Virginia was imposing Jim Crow racial segregation and disenfranchising their African American population. The public events to celebrate the installation of both of these statues were organized by local chapters of Confederate organizations and included parades by the Ku Klux Klan, cross burnings on African American properties, and a general climate of white supremacy. And so in light of this history, the commission ultimately recommended either moving the Lee and Jackson statues to a different site where they could be contextualized, or transforming them in place in their respective namesake parks, which would also be renamed. In conjunction with these changes, the commission also recommended the creation of additional memorials to Charlottesville enslaved and free Black populations, including of African American monuments that had been removed under the guise of, that had been destroyed under the guise of urban renewal. So the commission then tried to reimagine Charlottesville past and tell a different story. But in fact, what happened was that when the city tried to remove, when the city council voted to remove the statue, there was a lawsuit that was opposed to the decision and prevented its removal. And then in June 2017, in August 2017, the Unite the Right rally, where protester Heather Heyer was killed by white supremacists, was held to protest the removal of the planned removal of the Lee statue and the renaming of Lee Park to Emancipation Park and Jackson Park to Justice Park. Now, this and this history, convoluted as it is, continues because, and I'm going to, in the interest of time, just not give you some more context that I'm happy to do in Q&A about what happened after 2017. But the removal was prevented by a law that Virginia had on the books that prevented the removal of war memorials. That law was amended. There was a new law passed by the state legislature allowing local municipalities to remove war monuments, but the legal case to prevent the removal of the Lee and Jackson monuments is still before the courts, and so they remain in place. So this tortured history of Charlottesville attempt to grapple with its Confederate monuments shows how approaches to, and these are pictures from the Unite the Right rally, and now I'm turning to the contemporary moment of monument removal, is to say that Liberal proceduralism then fails to grapple with the effects of racist commemoration. It situates protests, especially those that become uncivil or violent, as normatively suspect. But it has been, in fact, Black protest which has galvanized and enabled monument removal. Current protests for racial justice have led to a spate of Confederate monument removals and to the abandonment of the Confederate battle flag, the renaming of numerous buildings and institutions, which are astonishing changes if one considers that this seemed inconceivable even months ago. And as the Charlottesville example shows, that it took years, and in many cases, efforts are still ongoing to remove some of these statues. So momentum for removal has come from moments when Black suffering is hyper visible, but that this is itself a problematic distribution of loss, as the removal of statues made of stone should not require sacrifices of blood by Black people. At the same time, instead of viewing decisions to remove racist monuments in the wake of protests as short-circuiting democratic deliberation and the legitimacy it confirms, we should see vandalism and other acts of spontaneous removals, I argue, as forms of Black agency that are ultimately more radically democratic and participatory than more traditional forms of political activism. We need to flip the script and approaches to monument removal that avoid focusing on the work that monuments do, and that assumes that democratic legitimacy is the result of deliberation and following established legal procedures. Instead of viewing the removal of statues without extended periods of citizen deliberation and litigation as failures of politics, we should embrace spontaneous toppling of statues as a democratic politics of insurgency. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here. And I second Crystal's comments about the opportunity to be able to talk about monuments and memorials. So I'm going to share a screen with a PowerPoint with you this afternoon. I will attempt to share my screen with you. One second. Okay, so what I'd like to do is to think about interventions into public space and to consider this question of how particularly Black Lives Matter has redefined public space and articulated social justice issues through art. And I want to look at two monuments today: the Reclaiming the Monument project in Richmond, Virginia, which is a series of projections onto the Robert E. Lee Memorial, and Society's Cage, which was an installation put up on the Smithsonian Mall here in Washington, D.C. And I see three things at play with these interventions. The first that was really striking to me is this notion or the potential for healing and for a grieving process to happen through memorialization, both for the individual and the collective. The second is that these two interventions are deeply about a multisensorial experience that I can't fully convey here through a PowerPoint, but is key to understanding the monument. So combinations of both visual, sound play a very active role in these memorials. And the third is the ephemeral quality of both Reclaiming the Monument and Society's Cage, that they are movable monuments, so to speak. They can be, particularly Society's Cage is raising money to have the monument travel from city to city. And so this is a very different kind of monument building that we are engaged in the present moment in the context of George Floyd's death. So I want to start with Reinventing the Monument, which was really in some ways created as a very individual response by Dustin Klein, who is a Richmond-based light projection artist. And he is quite well known actually for doing live music events. So his projections really came out of a feeling of wanting to address the violence he saw in the death of George Floyd. On the screen, I'm showing you on the right actually is a photograph I took in 2013 of the memorial before it came down. I had taken a class to Richmond to experience Monument Avenue and the very complicated arrangement of monuments and housing there. And then on your left is an image of the Robert E. Lee Monument with graffiti in early June of 2020, post the May 25th death of George Floyd. So Dustin Klein did his first projection of George Floyd on July 18th, 2020. His plan is to continue this process until the statue is removed, and that is up for debate when the Lee Memorial will be removed. There is a hearing in mid-October, and so we'll have to wait to see what happens with that. But one of the interesting things that he wanted to engage is this idea is, can you have healing through this projection? Can we reclaim a monument to tell a different kind of story? Can we take the Confederate monument here, Mercier's image of Lee on his horse underneath with this enormous plinth, and can we project on it? And in this instance, he took a photograph of George Floyd, and so you're seeing screened through it, the graffiti, and then took the letters BLM and put them on so that they would be projected onto the side of the horse. Now, one of the most important things that Dustin Klein talks about in relationship to his monument is this idea that they are the first 10 to 14 days of his project was really about as a memorial to the victims of police brutality, with George Floyd really being the motivating factor for him to take his incredible light screen and technology outside into Monument Avenue and do these projections, and later on private property, so he would not have conflicts with the police. So that Dustin Klein was really interested in this idea of being very respectful, but he wanted of the neighbors who lived in this neighborhood and in him kind of taking over this space with the projections. But he, first of all, does not consider himself to be a political artist, but felt activated by what he has seen in this violence that we're experiencing in the United States in this moment. And he uses this really interesting phrase. He said he wanted to get rid of the dark energy or the negative energy of the Confederate monument and replace it with this positive representation. What we will later do is to include historical figures on the monument. But he also sees this project as a moment of healing, that people who have traditionally not been invited into the space of Monument Avenue, particularly brown and black people, can enter this space and do their own grieving and healing by being present during these projections. So on the left, you see a projection that says, "No America without Black America." And then on the right is a famed image of Harriet Tubman when she's in her 50s that says, "Slavery is the next thing to hell." And this projection, particularly of Harriet Tubman, was projected on June 20th. And he was able to keep it projected the entire time that there was violent confrontations between police, where they were firing rubber bullets and tear gas at the protesters. What was really, in this instance, critical for Dustin Klein is this idea also that his monuments, and I'm going to pay you a very short clip, he also projected historic video onto the monument. And in this case, we'll see an image of Malcolm X that's projected on the Lee Memorial.
The students and others to study the problems of our people for a period of time and then come up with a new analysis and give us some new ideas and some new suggestions as to how to approach a problem that too many other people have been playing around with for too long. That it was my intention.
It would help that I unmute so you can hear me. So here you have him bringing into this space Black voices and letting kind of a reconsideration of what this space can be. And that's really important, this kind of push on Monument Avenue and on its historic status into a space that can be inclusive and that can be a space of healing. And so this is at the core of the monument, Reinventing the Monument project that Dustin Klein began. The second project is one that surprisingly was installed in DC just at the end of August, early September, that was surprisingly not very well advertised. I found out personally about it after it had come down. Society's Cage was installed on the Smithsonian Mall, near the Smithsonian Castle, and it was done by an architectural group called the Smith Group. with 2 lead designers, 2 African-American men and a predominantly team of African-Americans, Dayton Schroeder and Julian Arrington, who conceptualized this piece. And this is a highly conceptual work of art. The Architects Foundation is also providing some support to them as well. Now, the Society Cage is an interpretive installation. It is how the Smith Group defines it. And it's meant to symbolize the historic forces of racialized state violence in the form of this cube. And it's conceived in solidarity, very particularly to Black Lives Matter movement. And again, they use this language of creating a monument for building empathy and healing. So here you see this pavilion with a series of bars which are hung from a cube with a cavernous interior. And then along the exterior, one can see various quotes about state violence, lynching, and this kind of imperfect justice system that we have in the United States. One can also use QR codes to access additional information about Society Cage. The bars are made out of cortine steel, and they in fact are based on data points. And this is really fascinating that when one sees it during the daylight, it forms a bar, a grid on the floor of the monument that suggests a grid and a table of data that we're seeing here. But I'm going to return actually to this image because one of the things that is interesting about Society Cage's notion that this can create empathy and healing is the very extensive way in which they have formulated their project. So that the cube is at its center is this, what they would like to suggest is that the perfect cube suggests a fair and equitable society. The void, which you see with the red at the base of it, is carved out of the cube. And the void is thought to be an obstacle-filled path, symbolizing African-American struggle for survival in the United States. And then the gravity section where you can see lynching, capital punishment, and these other death by police and mass incarceration are also physically manifested data through those long poles that you saw earlier. And then the last 3 components are these bars that represent the systemic oppression of white supremacy. And then we also have the 1 and 4 bars represent that's the statistical probability of being imprisoned as a Black American in the United States. And finally, we get this notion of data. So that it is a very, a monument that relies on the viewer to do a lot of work. You can enter this memorial, and it is also a monument that has music playing when you enter the interior. And you take 8 minutes and 46 seconds, and there's a soundtrack behind you that you're listening to, but you attempt to hold your breath for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. The amount of time in which George Floyd was murdered by the police. And then once you have done this act of breathing or not breathing, you submit a video, audio file to the Smith Group talking about your experience. So I can talk more about this. It's a very complicated, both of these are really complicated memorials, but they get at this idea that that monuments can do emotional work, that they can help us move through grief, they can help us build empathetic capacities. So that is it for now, and then I will have more to say, I think, during question and answers. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Let me just start to share my screen. So let me echo my, my colleagues in thanking the organizers, thanking Soraya and Trey and Trisha and Steve and my fellow panelists. It is a great joy to be here amidst the time that we all know we are experiencing being quite filled with sorrow. I'm going to switch our focus a little bit and look away from the United States to what has transpired in South Africa related to monuments and the politics of monumentalization, because I'm interested in what happens both after monuments come down and what new sorts of monuments might be erected in their place. And then generally, I'm very interested in what happens after there's forms of political transition, after iterations of white supremacist systems are ended. What happens on the other side of that, and what role do monuments play and white art play in helping us to make sense of this? And to begin here, and I apologize for the obscenity on this particular image, I want to look at a well-known moment in politics related to monuments that occurred in South Africa a few years ago in March 2015, which had to do with the figure of Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes, who most of you are probably familiar with, the man who had endowed the Rhodes Scholarships, what made his fortune as first a diamond and then a gold magnate in South Africa at the very end of the 19th century, and was quite an enthusiast, to put it mildly, for the British Empire, and was seen as responsible for a great deal of the creation of the system of white supremacy that Rhodes and others built in South Africa at the end of the 19th and into the early 20th century. Among Rhodes's various deeds in South Africa was he granted a large portion of his estate outside of Cape Town for the founding of a university for the training of white South Africans. And this became the University of Cape Town, which was for much of the 20th century and still today recognized as South Africa's most elite educational institution. It was a whites-only university for much of its existence, but over the course of the 1980s, and then especially over the course of the 1990s, it became a more diverse campus as democracy and multiracial governance took hold in South Africa. But in 2015, after decades in which many people thought that transformation had not gone far enough in South Africa, the Rhodes Monument, this memorial that was erected in the 1930s as a way of thanking him for granting this gift to create this university, the memorial itself became the target of a great deal of protest. Students and others in the community very upset about what they perceived as a lack of transformation in general in South Africa, and then at a more micro level, a lack of transformation in Cape Town, and especially at the University of Cape Town, which with many people experienced to remain as a white supremacist institution, began to focus on this monument to Rhodes. There was regular protests, there was graffiti, there was all of this sort of focal energy that we can see in these images. And for a month, there was a widespread series of protests that garnered international attention and eventually ended up helping to motivate a new generation of political action in South Africa that soon moved away from the issue of monuments per se, but still held within it this idea that monuments are things that must fall. This movement became known as Rhodes Must Fall. And it was not just about the statue, it was about everything associated with the statue. A month after these protests began, the Board of Governors at the University of Cape Town eventually decided to remove this statue, and what will be erected in its place still remains to be seen. This moment in 2015 was a really fascinating moment into looking at what had and had not happened in South Africa related to monuments, and the monuments in particular of the prior regime. The image on the lower right here is an image that became relatively commonplace as protesters associated with the Afrikaner nationalist movement that had helped to create apartheid, the utmost iteration of white supremacy in South Africa, began to speak very openly about their anxiety and fears that memorials to their heroes were going to be taken down, very similar to what my colleagues have shared regarding Confederate statues in this country. And on a number of occasions, people chained themselves to these statues, making it very clear that they would object to their being removed. Now, the irony of that act of protest by these white nationalists, was that the post-apartheid South African government's policy on memorials had been more or less to let them lie unbothered in the new democratic dispensation. There was no effort to take down, for example, the Voortrekker Monument, the image you see on the upper left of this slide here, which is a memorial that was inspired by a German precedent, and then was erected just on the eve of the advent of apartheid in the late 1940s, an event celebrated as the culmination of Afrikaner nationalism. The Voortrekker Monument still stands in South Africa. So too does this statue of Paul Kruger, a 19th century Afrikaner leader, well known for his leadership of the Transvaal during the South African War at the end of the 19th century, whose statue was erected originally outside of the central train station in Pretoria, and then moved into the center of town where 100 years later, this woman changed herself to it to demand that it not be removed. And the post-apartheid ANC government, though, never had any intention to remove it, and it still stands. Which isn't to say that the ANC government hasn't been invested in some renovation of the politics of memorialization in South Africa, but in the aftermath of democracy in 1994. There's a politics of naming that is often seen as cities like Pretoria have been officially renamed back to, as best as what people can tell, was the indigenous name for that region before the advent of Afrikaner trekkers in their midst and the creation of a city called Pretoria. This slide is from the city of Durban on the country's southeastern coast, which made it very explicit the work that it was going to do in trying to renovate memory by actually crossing out with red tape the names associated with the period of British colonial rule and making it very clear that they were creating new names, these new names associated with the struggle for African liberation in the country. But this sort of overt renovation of memory it's symbolic, and it's taken place in some areas, most notably in urban areas, as I indicated. But in general, the main approach that the ANC government has taken to the question of monuments and memorials that, in a sense, helped to motivate these protesters in 2015 who thought that they hadn't done enough, was what the ANC did essentially was to complement old practices of memorialization by just bringing new stars into the firmament of those worthy of being memorialized. Not surprisingly, what this has meant is that across the country today, you find no shortage of memorials to Nelson Mandela. And it's notable that in the way that the ANC has helped to fundraise and to erect these memorials, that they're in many senses just continuing the practices of their predecessors at the seat of South African power, the National Party of the apartheid government. Because what they've in a sense have done is continued to erect memorials without actually threatening the genre of memorial. There are new patriarchs, new founding fathers who in a sense pick up from Rhodes and pick up from people like Paul Kruger, even though we would all perhaps, of course, I would assume, mostly be more sympathetic to the figure of Nelson Mandela than either of those gentlemen. But the genre remains intact. Sometimes there's moments of creativity in it. This image on the left is one I actually like very much, which is a memorial to the site, at the site where Mandela was captured by the South African police in 1962 in a rural area of what is today the province of KwaZulu-Natal. And it is a series of metal staves that are driven into the ground to evoke the experience of being behind bars, but viewed at a distance, they form a very famous image of Mandela taken after his release from Robben Island, looking through the windows of his cell. It is, in terms of its artistic accomplishment, I would think a little bit more accomplished than what are more commonplace statues such as this one, this larger-than-life bronze erected at the Union Buildings in Pretoria at the capital of the country, where Mandela welcomes all to the new democracy. But the note I want to leave you on, though, is that I think one thing that is overlooked in the process by which memorials are erected to replace the prior generation of memorials is that memorials themselves are often imperfect vehicles for the sorts of memory work that needs to be done after periods of trauma. As the ANC government, on the one hand, was beginning to erect memorials over the course of the 1990s, so too elsewhere in the country were people thinking more creatively, I think, about a politics of memory. One of the spaces where this took place was in Cape Town itself, where over the course of the 1960s to the 1980s, a very vibrant and diverse multiracial neighborhood known as District 6 had been labeled a black spot by the Afrikaner government and had been almost entirely removed by the 1980s. The image on the upper left shows what it looked like in its heyday in the 50s. On the lower right, what it looked like in the 1980s after the apartheid government's bulldozers had gotten to it. But almost immediately after the last wave of destruction was complete at District 6, and after the last residents had been removed outside of the city center, the transition to democracy began, which meant that it was at this moment where memory was at its most vivid, and the potential to redress memory was also at its most realizable. And in the early 1990s, the community that had lost their homes in District 6 were able to purchase a museum, an old church on the outskirts of that neighborhood, where they erected a museum to its memory. And this was this really remarkable museum because its insistence was not on a sort of patriarchal founding father narrative, but rather it was on loss. It was on what happens to intimate domestic spaces when they are evacuated at the hands of the government, when people find themselves no longer being able to access what had once been a home. The exhibitions at the museum are often very modest. The idea is that this is intimate domestic space. And at its center was a mural painted on the floor of the church and sheathed in protective plastic, which was a map of the neighborhood that had just been erased only years before. And old residents and visitors were invited to come and walk those streets that no longer existed, and to take markers or Sharpies and to note where it was that they lived and what they had lost with that removal. Anyone who visits the District 6 Memorial understands it to be this powerfully evocative space of memory. And I want to leave on that note because I think it's something that we need to think about, which is on the other end of trauma, how do we think about how the possibility of memory as being a space of healing and a space of redress, not only in the sense of reparation, but also in a sense of dealing with the psychological and lingering effects of trauma. But I have to leave on a slightly sobering note though, because the District 6 Museum has managed to keep alive the memory of District 6 well past the destruction of that neighborhood. But it is now faced with an unprecedented crisis. Because of COVID, tourism, Cape Town's major industry, has completely dried up, and the District 6 Museum is facing closure. And so I think that Soraya or someone else was going to include a link on the chat where if you have any money to spare, the District 6 Museum is desperate for donations so that it can keep its doors open so that the memory that survived the end of apartheid might not be erased because of COVID in this particular moment of crisis. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you to all four of our speakers for these terrific comments and terrific reflections. I'm going to be moderating this next section of our discussion. We have a number of questions that have come in, and there's likely space for additional ones to be asked. So please do feel free to use the Q&A to address our speakers either individually or collectively, and I'll do my best to get to as many questions that come through the Q&A as I can. Let me start by raising a question that Dan mentions at the very end of his presentation when he talked about how on the other end of trauma, we might wonder how we think about memory as a space of healing, but also about the psychological and lingering effects of trauma. But I want to direct this question to both Crystal and Renee, and really frame it more as a question about the emotional work that monuments and memorials have done and might do. Crystal, it strikes me that you touched upon this a bit in your discussion of the question of the 5-year-old girl thinking about the statue in New Orleans, certainly an emotional response in part. And that Renee, you also talked a little bit about the emotional work that monuments and memorials and public art of all sorts can do. So I wonder, Crystal, if we might start with you and hear a few quick reflections on that question, if you have them, and then turn to Renee. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important question. And I think, you know, monuments do all kind of work, right? And the question is whether when we're tearing them down, I'm sure it does. I haven't had the pleasure of tearing down a monument, but I can imagine there might be something cathartic in that act, you know. So I think one can imagine a host of emotions, and I've mostly thought about the work of healing around the building of monuments, right? The work that folks have done around the suffrage monument to include Black women in New York, or the efforts to raise money and create a monument for Ida B. Wells in Chicago, right? It's clear to me what work monuments can do in terms of like recovering the past. And I'm actually doing work for helping us to imagine the future in a way that is hopeful, right? I think when we think about the lynching memorial, for example, and that museum in Montgomery is built on the foundation of a warehouse that used to imprison enslaved people before they were taken to the slave market, right? And that there's a new thing there, but it doesn't erase that past, right? So there's still something we can celebrate in that space in Montgomery, but there's something very painful about that site that we have to reckon with. And I think one of the people asked, in New Orleans, that pedestal is still there, right? Robert E. Lee is gone, but the pedestal is still there. And so that people still have to reckon with the memory, right? And the effort and the wealth that went into putting up that memorial and the work that it was intended to do. We can tear it down, but the memory doesn't go away, right? The question is, and maybe Renee can speak to this more clearly than I, is what do we do with that pedestal, right? How do we reclaim it? Or do we not reclaim it? Do we see it for what it is and create some other kind of space of healing around it? I don't have the answer, but I think it's something we have to consider and think through.
So Crystal, thank you. I think those are some really important points that you're making. And I will return to the pedestal at the end because I have some ideas about that. I think that what is to me seems really significant in this moment is, and I'm glad, Crystal, that you've raised the National Museum of Peace and Justice. I think that memorial in particular forces you to have a deep traumatic experience. It's the only way I can describe it, having gone there on opening day for their opening ceremonies in 2018, that it is meant to elicit a deep, deep emotional response from you. And then it's meant to make you think about history, to really reevaluate what is your place in this history, what do you understand about the lynching and the history of slavery, lynching, and mass incarceration. And then once you exit the memorial, it is about what then do we reclaim? Do we reclaim those boxes and bring them back to our communities and then do that really hard work of talking about lynching in our communities? So there is an incredibly interesting up point at the end of that memorial. What I think is happening with the society change is that it's driven through music, through sound, and through those long poles that are extending downward actually move, so that they are moving with the environment, so that there's that sensation of the moving monument, there's the sound, and then there's a constellation of lights that are shining on you. And then you kneel as you listen to this soundscape that is 8 minutes and 46 seconds. So when you're in that, you are absolutely part of that violent act that happened to George Floyd. And you're being asked to process it through your own body and when I mean that, through all of your senses, you're asked to respond to that. And then I believe what I think the Smith Group is really getting at is that you then take action afterwards. So you have that emotional response, you have that grieving response. The healing that may come afterwards is action. So I point to that. These pedestals are a problem. So I think there are a lot of artists doing interesting, as we see with the work in Richmond, there are artists like Dustin Klein who are using the pedestal to do projections, to do performance art, to do new kinds of monuments that incorporate the pedestal. I live very close to Alexandria, Virginia, where they've taken down the Confederate monument that was in the middle of the street, and they removed everything. I was there on the day where they were literally flattening out the street and regrading it. So that is, for me, actually another way of going about it, is to actually remove it from the present so that we are not actually visibly even seeing that pedestal anymore, as a reminder, right, of that Confederate legacy. So I'll stop there, but I have more to say about this healing process, because I do think we are in a critical moment where many Americans because of COVID, have not had the capacity to grieve. And they haven't had capacity to grieve over COVID, and they haven't had the capacity to grieve over what we are witnessing around police brutality. And some of these memorials offer that potential for the grieving process to happen.
Thank you both. Let me take this conversation to Juliet Hooker and see if I can ask Juliet if you want to talk a little bit more about Charlottesville post 2017 that I know you have thoughts about, and maybe you might be able to address that period and that place through a combination of two questions that came in the chat. You can choose how you want to tackle these. But we have one question that asks directly if, in your opinion, racist or colonial monuments can be meaningfully repurposed at all, or do they always need to come down? And a second question, in a different vein and perhaps with a different spirit, someone asks, you mentioned that political theorists and philosophers tend to focus on civic efforts of statue removal rather than the political function or the political effects of monuments. And for those people who may be in the audience today who are engaged in the fight to remove statues and monuments that they think of as racist, as damaging, and as in need of removal, do you have any advice or recommendations to avoid falling into that rhetoric about procedure, or how best to combat it when those people in power who are contesting removal inevitably attempt to hear out all sides to engage with what I think you called a liberal framework for discussion of these matters? So either any part of that long question or set of questions that I asked, and I apologize for the rambling nature. Thanks.
Those are really good questions. I'll just say about the issue of contextualization. I think one of the problems with contextualization is that it is really difficult to do, right? So if you have an enormous statue like the Lee Monument and you put a little plaque, that's not really changing the nature of the monument, right? So contextualization needs to be commensurate to the scale of the monument, and it needs to do something like what Renee and Daniel were mentioning in their remarks. It needs to do something different. It needs to give you a different experience. And so I think, some of the most effective actually forms of contextualization are actually these spontaneous ones. So I think the reclaiming the Lee Monument is a very effective form of contextualization, but it's unlikely, right, that a city council would agree to, invite graffiti artists or other people to come in and make the space their own. Maybe some would, but I think that points to the problem or the way in which the sort of legal procedural route creates these, these kind of dead ends. And Charlottesville here is a good example. They had initially renamed, they couldn't take down the monuments because there was a lawsuit, but they had renamed the park Emancipation Park and Justice Park. And then they were prevented from moving the monuments. They had tried putting shrouds. The courts forced them to take the shrouds down. And so the statues were just standing there in these renamed parks. And so an African-American activist actually asked the council to rename them again, because they felt like these had not become spaces for reflection. They weren't a place where people could reflect on for example, the Black neighborhoods that had been demolished in order to build the city. There weren't places where people could reflect on the city's racist past. And so there is a way in which, as we think about how to move forward, focusing on these on following the law and on these sort of legal procedural routes really, I think, becomes difficult, because there's a way in which that becomes a way of delaying any kind of action, right? I mean, this is the way the process usually works, that you have these stalemates that had gone on for years, and it's actually been protests that have suddenly made things that didn't seem possible, right? So in the case of Charleston, for example, there had been a long fight to get some contextualization for the Calhoun statue, and even the small plaque that they wanted to put up saying that he had been a defender of slavery was rejected, because some felt that it was not simply a statement of historical fact, but was bringing in ideology. Now, after the protest in 2020, not only was there wasn't even contextualization. Calhoun came down, something that before that was impossible to imagine. So what I would say about just this question of how to deal with this is not necessarily to not try to go through those means, but it's to say that direct action is often what pushes elected officials and city councils to do things that they would not have thought, and for citizens to support those changes in ways that they would not have perhaps in the past. And yeah, I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you so much. Dan, I want to turn to you. I mean, I want to thank you for bringing the context of another kind of international frame to this conversation for an audience that's probably largely thinking very understandably about US developments and US conflicts. And I want to ask you to sort of think aloud, if you can, about the ways in which the South African case really ought to be guiding, in part, activist efforts to think about statuary and memorialization in the United States. And one of the things that occurs to me about your talk is that you note that some of the memorials and statues that we ought to be concerned about are in fact not products of late 19th century eras of empire. The same era that we think about often when we think about Confederate memorials, so many of them, as Juliet notes and others, created during the late 19th century. It seems to me that we do have comparable examples in the United States of memorials that have been under severe critique in recent months, in recent years, that also were not late 19th century products, but that were actually created in the mid and late 20th century. I'm thinking, for example, of the Thomas Fallon statue, a colonial statue in San Jose that was burned and damaged 2 days ago during the Breonna Taylor protests in Northern California. That's a 1980s statue. Or the Juan de Oñate statue built in the 1990s to celebrate conquistadores in New Mexico, which was critiqued and damaged in the 1990s, and then again this summer during the George Floyd protests. So I guess to you, the question is two-part. One is about thinking about what the South Africanist wisdom brings to our thinking in the United States, and also how we ought to think about late 20th century memorialization and what ought not to be continued from earlier periods of statue building and memorial making.
Thank you for that. I apologize if there were small children in my background a minute ago. The nature of Zoom webinars is we can be together, but then random kids come into the room. Not random. I know who he is. So thank you for the question, Steve. And I think, I don't know, the South African story, on the one hand, is I think very salutary because it shows how memorials are actually quite useful as focal points for rage. And no matter when exactly, the politics of when a memorial is erected and the chronology of actual memorial structures is a really revealing one. But that they are a space where people can congregate to reject that memory is actually very productive. And so in that sense, I actually find memorials to be very useful spaces. I think the South African case, though, and here's where I think it's really challenging, within the mindset, as best as I can access it, of the younger generation of activists in South Africa, the figure of someone like Nelson Mandela, who's an internationally renowned, almost sainted figure, is deeply, deeply controversial. And there we can imagine a world in which people are going to focus their rage on memorials to Nelson Mandela, much like elsewhere in the African continent. As some of you probably realize, there's been a great deal of energy focused on memorials to Gandhi, because Gandhi, as an apostle of nonviolence, is celebrated across the African continent, as also as someone who's a symbol of national self-determination. But as people have come to reckon with Gandhi's overt racism, they think it's no longer appropriate that such memorials still stand. There is a big Gandhi memorial in Johannesburg that has not yet gotten the focus of that rage, but it will come at some point. the South African story, I think, in that sense, is that the ways in which these spaces become public scripts, and they're not necessarily, once they're in the public space, they're not necessarily, they're out of, as with all works of art, their creator can only do so much to determine their interpretation. And so they remain these public sites of reckoning, I think, that in very provocative ways. And so part of my approach and part of what I'm thinking about memorialization, and I'd be curious what other people think about this, is how memorials themselves, as someone in the Q&A addressed, are sites of memory. And memory is, of course, subjective. Memorials are not enacted because they are something objectively true that they need to display. Rather, they are an argument. They are an interpretation of the past and an argument about what some people should think matters in the present. And part of my approach to memorials is that memorials are, it comes from a space of professional jealousy, because memorials serve as history for much of the public, the public who perceive memorials to be history, rather than what we historians think we offer through our scholarship. And what I think is really striking, I think what we need are more memorials, more and more provocative memorials that are creative memorials. And for me, one of the best memorials of 2020, prior to all of this amazing stuff that people have been talking about and that Renee shared in particular, was actually the first episode of Watchmen. Because the first episode of Watchmen served as a memorial to the Tulsa massacre that made clear that Americans needed to ask questions about what we do and do not know about our own past. And I found that profoundly effective. And so I think these sorts, we need a more expansive idea of what memorials can be. And I think if Renee wanted to speak to some of that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'm so glad. Can I just jump in because I have to leave in just a few minutes to teach class. So I want to jump in because Daniel, I was really struck when you talked about like the genre of monuments remaining intact and how problematic this is. That we are in a moment where I think I'm on the other end of monument building than you. I think we actually need a pause. I think we need to think really hard about what we're going to populate our landscapes, our public spaces with. I think there are issues that you point out about this kind of patriarchal representation that keeps on happening and being perpetuated through monument building. We have a group of artists who are working strongly in figuration and realistic representation. And so that's part of like that genre remaining intact. It's not a critical kind of assessment of why we're doing this. And you know, Daniel, I think that one of the words we have not used today is counter monument. And I think in a part, that's what you're talking about is how do we devise counter monuments that are engaging and tell us very different kinds of stories? And do they have to be a monument? And someone had asked a question about a mural, which I need to leave, but I think murals are a very effective tool for doing this. And we see in Minneapolis this incredible outpouring of murals dedicated to George Floyd, and they're documenting them. There's a database that has 1,500 murals in them at St. Thomas University in Minneapolis. So there are these efforts to actually document ephemeral art, right? In a sense of creating the longevity of their life that we can return to them. But I do think we need a complete reconsideration and questioning of the traditional 19th century Beaux-Arts monument. So I'll leave it at that. And thank you very much for allowing me to.
Thank you, Renee. Crystal or Juliet, would you either of you like to respond to anything that's been said thus far? If not, I have another question.
I think Renee nailed that one along with Daniel. I think they kind of hit it out of the park. So if you want to bring in another question, that's great.
Juliet, is that okay with you? Okay. Crystal, let me ask you your views as a historian of African Americans and of the United States of how we're going to, it's a two-part question. Number one, how you anticipate teaching this moment in 10 years as an historian, as an historical moment. And number two, what, if anything, is being done in your view that's critically important to document this moment, to collect artifacts and testimonies and other things around this moment so that people like you in the future can teach and learn from the events of, roughly 2015 to 2020 that we've been discussing?
I mean, those are both great questions, Steve. And I think I'll start with the last one about what's being done. And I think there are scholars in that I know who are working in AFAM and through political science, who are doing a lot of work to kind of document what's happening on the ground. I can think of one of our graduate students, Gwen Prowse, who kind of is running a story project with Veshla Weaver, and I think Tracy Mears in the law school is involved, but they're kind of doing this on the ground work, getting people to talk about these experiences on the ground. And some of them are in kind of interesting art installations as well, right? That people go in and tell these stories. So of course, as someone who's deeply invested in oral history, I think, we've got to get people's stories, people telling their stories. And I think as someone raised in the Q&A is that, we're going to have to hear from these artists who are doing this work. And Brian Stevenson is amazing at talking about what he wants the memorial to do, what he hopes it will do, why he did it. There's no shortage of footage or written text about that. So in some ways, I think we all have to be thinking about what the archive looks like and how we're going to contribute to that. In terms of how I will teach this in 20 years from now, I don't know, Steve. I have to reckon with it every day in my classes right now. So I'm teaching this course called the Long Civil Rights Movement, right? And so every Monday and Wednesday, I'm coming in for live lectures and conversations, and there's no way around these issues, right? I can't just talk about World War II without reckoning what's happening in the streets. And so I think for me right now, the challenge is, how do I reckon with this history now? As a historian who is, says to my students, we've got to think about 1940s, and some days you're going to have to stay with me here in the 1940s and 50s. And there's some days where we just can't stay in the 50s because we have to reckon with that history is being made right now, and that history is so deeply connected to what we've been talking about, right? Thinking about strategy, thinking about long-term versus short-term, thinking about violence versus nonviolence. These are all the issues that our students are reckoning with about the past, but that they're reckoning with in their own activism right now. So, I don't know what I'll say about it 10 years from now. I hope that I can say I was out there in the streets, and that my students were out there, and this is what we were feeling and thinking. Hopefully I'll remember that, but it'll be in my lecture notes.
Thank you for that. Juliet, I want to ask you, Crystal talks about the feeling and the thinking that we're all doing, one hopes we're all doing at this moment, faced by the challenges that we are. And I guess I would love to hear your own personal thoughts about this, about, in part, how you as a scholar are trying to think about squaring one's personal reactions to ongoing events, but also one's obligations to the fields, and whether or not, maybe more abstractly, maybe more generally, you think that the field in which you're working is wrestling with the fundamental questions that are being raised by the social movements surrounding monuments and murals and movements, that after all is the focus of this panel. So you can answer this query kind of on the kind of personal side if you'd like, or just jump straight to the ways in which the fields that you're working with are or are not wrestling with some of the questions that I know you're thinking about deeply.
So in terms of I'm actually writing a project on loss and political loss. And so in both my research, and I'm teaching a course on loss and political activism, and we've been talking, we had proposed to do the course before COVID happened, and then it did. And so then we had to kind of incorporate it. And so, so I'm thinking all the time about these questions of what is it that motivates? How do people make losses political? But also, what are the costs and what are the ethical obligations that go along with with mobilizing loss for the sake of politics? So And I think my students are wrestling with these questions, both in terms of you know, their own questions about what's happening and how they should think about what they see, what's saturating their screens, what they're reading. You know, and of course, we're all in the middle of a pandemic and other kinds of ongoing losses in terms of anti-Black violence. And so I think everybody's trying to figure out, you know, how do you keep doing the everyday when it seems like, you know, there's a crisis happening, an ongoing crisis. And one of the things that I think is important to think about in that regard, and it has to do with this question of monuments versus memorials, is, you know, that monuments really are trying to freeze a moment in time, right? They're trying to tell a story about, you know, they're trying to tell a story about the past and also are prescriptive about the future and the present. And part of what I think is really difficult about trying to grapple with anti-Black violence is that it's ongoing, right? So that I think some of what we're wrestling with is the fact that if you look at the United States, if you look around the world, we have been very good about memorializing racism. We have a lot of monuments to racists. We don't know how to do anti-racist commemoration as well. We don't know what it means to try to think, I think, and to represent a kind of, you know, what the kind of civic values that we aspire to, or that some of us say we aspire to are. And I think this moment is forcing, you know, a kind of global reckoning with those questions that had been ongoing in many places and for some people, but that is now maybe more present for others, which is, you know, how do we think about what memorialization means if we're trying to foster, you know, sort of anti-racist political identities?
Thank you for those important thoughts. And I'm going to apologize to all of those questions that I'm not able to get to, and just ask one final question and leave this with Dan, since he was our last presenter. And since Juliet mentioned global reckoning. And so my question for you, Dan, if you could quickly just think aloud a little bit about what, if anything, the reckoning within the United States about statues and memorials and racial justice in recent years has meant for audiences elsewhere. I'm thinking obviously in the South African context, a context that you know so well, but if you have other broader thoughts about how these debates and conversations and movements are reverberating elsewhere, those would be welcome as well. Thank you.
And I think that what's striking about it is, to some sense, the South Africans would argue that they anticipated this moment of reckoning, and rather than their own politics derived from America. But I think what's really striking about the South African story is that South Africa is both was kind of trailed behind the rest of the continent, but also maybe has arrived at a place ahead of many other countries where there were the problem of memorials now is very much associated with memorials to nationalist elites and nationalist leaders, people like Robert Mugabe, whose record is much more checkered than the grandiose memorials that they erected to their own glory would suggest. And what's really striking is that there has yet to be, in many places, a widespread analysis and critique and assessment of that memorialization. One thing that, and so there is a sense that we don't yet know. And part of that is because in many of these places, there are questions about politics and questions about political participation that are still being worked out in the streets, often, I mean, similar to what we see in the United States, in contexts of great peril and great violence. And the question of memorialization and how one will enact memories to these moments and to these time periods remains one that's unasked. And part of the South African story that's so interesting, or at least not unarticulated, I should say unasked, so I can't speak to that. Part of what makes the South African case so interesting is it shows perhaps where this might yet go, much as they would argue they anticipated where this debate is going in the United States.
Well, thank you for that. I think it's an important place to close, to say that there's so much that hasn't been articulated here and so much more to say that each of our terrific panelists would love to talk about if we had more time. I want to thank CSREA for hosting this event, and to our panelists, Crystal Feimster, Juliet Hooker, Renee Ater, and Dan Magaziner. I want to thank everybody who attended today's conversation, particularly those of you who contributed to the questions this afternoon. And I'd like to invite everybody to join us for the next event in what we're thinking of as a series about monuments, murals, and movements. That next event will happen on Friday, November 6th, and it'll be hosted by the Stanford Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, along with the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture at the University of Chicago. You should see a poster and a registration link in the chat, and we really do hope to see all of you there. So thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon, and a big thanks to our panelists.